There was a certain stillness to the woods at dusk, that moment when the last rays of sunlight slipped behind the treetops and the world shifted from gold to indigo. It wasn't silence, not exactly. The hum of insects, the rustling of leaves, the distant call of something wild still filled the air. But underneath it all was a hush, like the forest was holding its breath. Jake sat cross-legged by the fire pit, coaxing flames to life with careful strikes of flint. His fingers were blackened from soot, but his focus never wavered. Sparks leapt upward, catching on the dry twigs, and soon the glow of fire lit his face in warm, flickering strokes. Across from him, Dylan unpacked the last of the gear from the truck bed, his movements fluid and practiced. Years of friendship had made them efficient. Jake handled the campfire, Dylan the tent and food. They barely had to speak to fall into rhythm. They'd been best friends since college, over 10 years now. Through breakups, career changes, cross-country moves, and the kinds of long midnight calls that only made sense between two people who never needed to explain anything. They had history, the kind that settled deep in the bones. The trip had been Dylan's idea, a weekend away from everything. No cell signal, no work emails, just the woods and firelight and whatever they brought with them. Jake had agreed without thinking twice. Now, as Dylan dropped into the camp chair beside him and cracked open a cold bottle of something, Jake's stomach did a slow turn. "Still know how to start a fire without a lighter," Dylan said, raising his drink in mock salute. Jake smirked. Some skills never fade. They sat in comfortable silence, the fire crackling between them. Jake let his eyes drift to Dylan's profile, the line of his jaw, the shadowed stubble, the faint glow of flame catching in his eyes. He looked peaceful, maybe even content. But there was something in the set of his shoulders, a tension Jake recognized. "You okay?" he asked. Dylan didn't answer right away. He took a sip of his drink, eyes fixed on the fire. "Yeah, just thinking." Jake waited, letting the moment stretch. With Dylan, silence wasn't something to fill. It was something to share. Finally, Dylan turned toward him, eyes meeting his in the low light. "You ever feel like there's something you've been holding back for too long?" Jake's breath caught. The question landed too close to the place he tried not to look at directly. Their eyes stayed locked, and something passed between them. Sharp, real, heavy with implication. Dylan's fingers tapped lightly against the armrest of his chair, like he was working through a thought he wasn't ready to speak. The fire popped, sending a burst of sparks into the air. Jake looked away, heart pounding. Later, after dinner and another round of drinks, they lay in their sleeping bags beneath the stars. The tent flaps were open, the night cool but not cold. Jake could hear Dylan breathing beside him. "Slow and steady, I can't sleep," Dylan said softly. Jake turned his head. "Too many trees?" Dylan huffed a laugh. "Too many thoughts." Jake rolled onto his side, propping himself on an elbow. The moonlight edged Dylan's face in silver. His expression was unreadable, but his gaze didn't move. Jake's chest tightened. "Then say it." Jake's voice was barely audible. "No?" Dylan shook his head. "I needed space to say something. Somewhere quiet." Jake sat up too, their knees almost touching in the small space of the tent. The air between them changed, thickened. Every nerve in Jake's body lit up. "I've been thinking about you," Dylan said. "About us?" Jake's pulse thudded in his throat. "I don't know when it started," Dylan went on, voice low and rough. "But it's been there. The way I look at you, the way I feel around you." Jake didn't speak, couldn't. Dylan reached out, slow, uncertain, and let his hand rest gently on Jake's knee. Jake's breath caught. His skin burned where Dylan touched him. The silence between them was electric, and then Jake leaned forward, just enough for their foreheads to meet, breath to breath. "I've been waiting for you to say that," he whispered. And in that stillness, with the fire dying outside and the stars watching in silence, something deep and unspoken finally rose between them. Not a kiss. Not yet. But the kind of closeness that shifts everything. The beginning of something neither of them could walk away from. The forest felt different the next morning, quieter, closer somehow. The air was thick with pine and earth, and the sky held that soft gray hue that promised rain, but hadn't made up its mind. Jake lay still in his sleeping bag, eyes open, heart heavy with the weight of the night before. Dylan had fallen asleep beside him, inches away. After that moment, that breathless closeness, forehead to forehead, their words hanging in the air like smoke. They hadn't said much, but nothing about it had felt unfinished, only suspended. Jake could still feel the heat of Dylan's hand on his knee, the unspoken words burning louder than the ones they dared say. He turned his head slowly. Dylan was already awake, propped up on one elbow, watching him. "Morning," Jake replied, equally quiet. They looked at each other a second too long. Then Dylan stretched, the movement drawing the hem of his t-shirt up slightly, revealing the narrow lines of his waist, the warm stretch of skin that made Jake's stomach twist in the worst and best way. They emerged from the tent without a word, the silence comfortable but pulsing with something deeper now. Awareness, anticipation. They moved around the campsite together, making coffee, stoking the fire, exchanging glances that lingered just a breath longer than before. Jake felt it every time they passed close. The way their shoulders brushed, the brief press of Dylan's hand on his lower back when he moved around him by the fire. Each touch lit something beneath his skin, made the air feel thicker, the day slower. They didn't talk about it. Not yet. That afternoon, they went hiking. The trail wove through trees like a secret path, the canopy above filtering sunlight into shifting patterns across the forest floor. The climb was steady, the rhythm of it grounding, but Jake's focus drifted. Every now and then, Dylan would glance back, sweat clinging to his temple, his shirt damp and sticking to his back. Jake would look away quickly, but not before feeling that tightening sensation in his chest. They reached a clearing that opened onto a ridge. Below them, the world stretched wide and green and wild. Dylan sat on a rock, catching his breath, arms braced behind him. Jake stood nearby, looking out, but he could feel Dylan watching him. "You've been quiet today?" Dylan said. Jake nodded slowly. "A lot on my mind." Dylan tilted his head. "About last night?" Jake turned to him, heart hammering. "Yeah." Dylan looked down at his hands, clasped between his knees. "I meant what I said." "I know." Dylan looked up. "You didn't seem surprised." Jake's mouth lifted in a half smile. "Because I wasn't." That made Dylan laugh under his breath. "I kept trying to convince myself it was just me, that you didn't feel it. But I couldn't stop noticing things." Jake stepped closer. "Like what?" Dylan looked up at him slowly. "The way you look at me, like you're trying not to." Jake swallowed, throat dry. "I noticed the same thing in you." Their eyes held again, and something in Dylan's expression shifted, softened. He stood, just a little too close, their bodies aligned by accident, or maybe not. The air felt charged again, that silent vibration Jake was starting to crave. "You've always been important to me," Dylan said. "But this feels different." Jake nodded, his voice caught in his throat. "It is." And then Dylan's hand rose, slow, uncertain, like testing the strength of a branch before putting weight on it. He brushed a finger along Jake's wrist, then rested his palm lightly over it. "I keep thinking about what would have happened if I'd said something sooner." Jake stepped into him, letting their foreheads meet again. "Don't think about before." They stayed like that, unmoving, for a long moment. Jake could feel the beat of Dylan's pulse in the space where their skin touched. Their breath mingled in the stillness. Then Dylan whispered, "What do we do now?" Jake didn't pull away. "We stop holding back." And slowly, with no hurry, their lips met. The kiss was quiet, not rushed, not hard, but full. Deep with years of unspoken tension, finally given shape. Dylan's hands came up to Jake's jaw, pulling him in, grounding him. Jake leaned into it, feeling the heat bloom between them like fire catching dry leaves. When they parted, they were both breathing hard. Dylan's voice was barely more than a breath. "That changes everything." Jake nodded. "Good." They didn't go back to camp right away. Instead, they sat on the ridge side by side, legs touching, hands tangled between them. The sky grew darker with clouds, but neither of them moved. Everything had changed. The rain came late in the day, a slow, steady rhythm tapping against the canvas of their tent like a heartbeat they couldn't ignore. It wasn't the kind of storm that demanded shelter. It was gentler, softer, like the world had decided to quiet down around them. The forest seemed to lean in closer, muffled and breathing with them. They'd returned to camp just before it started, damp from the mist that clung to the leaves, flushed from more than just the hike. Dylan had walked close the whole way back, not quite touching, but not distant either. Their silence was no longer uncertain. It was thick with meaning. Inside the tent, the glow from a lantern bathed everything in amber. Jake sat cross-legged near the entrance, a hoodie clinging to his skin, sleeves pushed up to his elbows. Dylan lay on his side across from him, one arm tucked beneath his head, watching Jake with a kind of quiet intensity that made the air hard to breathe. "Do you remember the lake trip we took that summer after college?" Dylan asked, his voice low, soft over the sound of rain. Jake smiled faintly. "You mean the one where you got sunburned so bad you couldn't wear a shirt for 2 days?" "Yeah," Dylan chuckled, eyes narrowing with the memory. "But I also remember you watching me like you were trying not to." Jake looked up slowly, Jake's stomach twisted. Not with regret, but with something warmer, deeper. "I used to lie awake those nights," he admitted, "thinking about how close you were, and how I'd never be able to say it." Their eyes locked. Dylan shifted slightly, pushing up on one elbow. "You're saying it now?" Jake's throat tightened. He nodded once. "Yeah, I am." Dylan leaned forward, slowly, like approaching something sacred. "Then say it." It hung there between them. Not desperate, not impulsive. Just true. Dylan reached out, brushing his fingers along Jake's wrist, then letting them slide upward until their hands met. The contact sent a jolt through Jake, like the snap of a live wire under skin. Their bodies inched closer, knees touching, hands locked together between them. Jake could feel the tension rising again. That quiet, breathless current that seemed to thread between their ribs and tug them closer every time they dared look too long. "I keep wondering if this is real," Dylan murmured. "Or if I'm going to wake up and find out I imagined it all." Jake's hand found Dylan's cheek, his thumb brushing over the edge of his stubble. It's real. I feel it everywhere. Rain pattered softly above them, wrapping their world in a cocoon of sound. Time slowed. Their breath mingled, their skin warmed against the chill outside, and something between them opened. A door that couldn't be closed again. When they finally pulled apart, their foreheads rested together, both of them breathless, eyes closed. Dylan nodded slowly, lips brushing his as he spoke. It's not. I've been waiting too long for this to be temporary. They lay down together, side by side, their bodies fitting naturally like puzzle pieces long kept apart. Dylan's arm wrapped around Jake's waist, their legs tangling beneath the blanket. Jake rested his hand over Dylan's heart, feeling it thrum steady and strong. In the stillness, Dylan whispered, "You've always felt like home." Jake didn't answer. He just pressed closer and held him tighter. The next day broke with a hush, a soft, golden light cutting through the trees, filtering into the tent like a promise. The rain had passed, leaving the forest washed and glistening. Dew clung to the leaves, catching sunlight like glass. Jake stirred first, his arm draped across Dylan's waist. Their bodies molded together under the shared warmth of the blanket. For a moment, he didn't move. He just watched the way Dylan's chest rose and fell beneath the fabric of his shirt, the way his face relaxed in sleep. He looked younger like this. Lighter, and Jake felt something pull tight in his chest, a soft ache that came not from longing anymore, but from having. Dylan stirred, shifting against him, eyes blinking open. He smiled when he saw Jake, sleep still heavy in his voice. "Morning." Jake smiled back. "Hey." They lay like that, still and close, the world just outside but not intruding. Dylan brushed a hand along Jake's forearm, his touch feather light, and Jake closed his eyes at the contact. It was nothing, a small thing, but it lit him up from the inside out. "Did you sleep okay?" Dylan asked. Jake nodded. "I don't think I've ever slept that well in a tent." Dylan chuckled, his fingers still moving slowly along Jake's arm. "Guess I'm good for something." Jake's voice was barely above a whisper. "You're good for a lot." They packed up camp slowly that morning, neither of them in a rush to return to whatever version of normal waited outside the forest. They moved around each other with ease. But now there were moments, touches, glances, that carried a different weight. When Jake passed Dylan the canteen, his fingers brushed Dylan's, and neither of them pulled away. When Dylan reached past him to grab a rope from the other side of the truck, his chest pressed briefly to Jake's back, and Jake's breath caught, eyes fluttering closed at the warmth. After everything was packed, they sat on the tailgate, sipping coffee, staring out at the trees. The birds had returned in full voice, the forest alive again with sound and color. But the space between them was quiet, not empty, just full in a different way. Jake broke the silence first. "I keep waiting to feel nervous about this, like it's all going to come crashing down." Dylan turned to him, brows drawn slightly. "And do you?" Jake looked at him. Really looked. "No, I don't." Dylan reached for his hand. "Me either." Neither of them said much on the drive back, not out of discomfort, but because some things were too big for words. Jake just stared out the window, Dylan's hand warm against his leg, the forest slipping away behind them like the closing of a chapter that had rewritten everything. When they got back to town, it was evening. Streetlights blinked on one by one. The familiar world returned, cars, sidewalks, people lost in their own lives. But something between them had shifted permanently. They both felt it. Jake hesitated outside his front door, bag slung over his shoulder, keys dangling in his hand. Dylan stood beside him, arms crossed, weight leaned casually against the porch rail. "I should let you settle in," Dylan said. But his voice lacked conviction, like he was waiting for Jake to stop him. Jake looked at him for a long beat. "Or you could stay." Dylan's eyes lifted, surprise softening into something warmer. "Yeah?" Dylan didn't answer. He just stepped forward, slid a hand around Jake's waist, and kissed him again. Not rushed, not uncertain, just sure. Inside, everything was quiet. They left their bags at the door and drifted through the house like it wasn't entirely real. Jake turned on a small lamp in the living room. Warm light pooled across the floor. Dylan stood in the doorway, just watching him. Dylan reached for him, then stopped holding it in. Their kiss this time was deeper, anchored. Jake felt it everywhere. In his hands, in his chest, in the space between who they used to be and who they were now. Dylan's hands found Jake's shoulders, then slid down his back, pulling him closer until their bodies pressed fully together. When they finally broke apart, breathless, Jake whispered, "This changes everything." Dylan smiled against his cheek. "Let it." And for the first time in a long time, Jake did. Sunday morning arrived without ceremony. No fanfare, no dreamlike glow, just soft light pressing through the curtains, the quiet hum of life outside the windows, and the familiar warmth of another body sharing the bed. Jake blinked slowly into wakefulness, consciousness rising gently like fog lifting off water. Dylan was already awake, lying beside him, eyes half-lidded, watching. For a moment, they said nothing. There was nothing to say. The world was real, solid, honest, not a dream stitched together by forest shadows or firelight or the rhythm of rain. They'd brought it all back with them. Every look, every kiss, every breath shared in the quiet of the woods had followed them home. Jake rolled onto his side, hand sliding up to Dylan's chest. His palm rested over the steady beat of his heart. Did we really do this? Dylan smiled, one hand coming up to cover Jake's. Yeah, we did. Jake's thumb traced lazy circles over the fabric of Dylan's t-shirt, his own heartbeat steady but full. He felt changed, not in a way that made him feel different, but in a way that made him feel whole. As if something inside him had found its match and finally stopped reaching. They spent the morning moving slowly. Breakfast was quiet, shared between sips of coffee and touches that said more than words could. Dylan leaned on the counter while Jake flipped pancakes. And at one point, Jake felt Dylan's hand slide around his waist, his chin resting on Jake's shoulder. He didn't pull away. They didn't have to define it. Not yet. It was enough that they were here, together. Not just as friends, not as something temporary, but as something real. That afternoon, they sat out back, legs stretched in the sun, the breeze carrying the scent of cut grass and spring heat. Dylan reached for Jake's hand as casually as if he'd done it every day of their lives. Jake threaded their fingers together without hesitation. You ever think about how long we didn't say anything? Dylan asked after a while, his voice quiet but not regretful. Jake exhaled, his thumb rubbing gently over Dylan's, all the time. I used to wonder if I was imagining it, Dylan said. The way you looked at me, the way everything almost happened, but didn't. Jake smiled, soft and bittersweet. I think I was scared of ruining us. Dylan turned his head, meeting Jake's eyes with a kind of unwavering warmth that made something deep inside him ache. You didn't ruin anything. They sat in the sun, hand in hand, and let that truth settle in. Later that night, Dylan lingered at the door, bag slung over his shoulder. He was supposed to head home, just across town, not far. But neither of them moved. Dylan's smile was quiet, full. Then I will. Inside, they didn't rush. They undressed slowly, not out of caution, but out of reverence. Dylan's shirt slid off with a quiet breath, Jake's fingers brushing his skin with care, like rediscovering something he never knew he'd missed. Their bodies fit together in the dark. But it wasn't about heat. It was about closeness. About every inch that spoke of trust, of knowing, of finally. Jake buried his face in the curve of Dylan's neck, the scent of him dizzying, clean skin and faint pine, sweat and memory. Dylan's arms wrapped around him in response, holding him with a strength that felt like safety. They lay like that for a long time, tangled in sheets and silence, not just lovers, not just best friends. Something more. Something they hadn't had words for until now. Dylan's voice broke the quiet. This is the best thing I never saw coming. Jake smiled into his chest. I did. Dylan laughed softly. You did? I hoped, Jake whispered. And then you surprised me. Dylan kissed his temple, slow and lingering. I'm not done surprising you. Jake closed his eyes, heart full, the world outside forgotten. And in that stillness, wrapped in warmth, breath, and something bigger than either of them, they stopped pretending. This was no longer about what they could lose. It was about everything they were finally brave enough to find.